Due Process, winner of 14 New York and Mid-Atlantic Emmys, including the 2009 awards for Best Interview Program and Best Discussion Series.
Charge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
You may not recognize the man who's being sworn in, but you're probably familiar with some of his famous friends. They came out in an unprecedented way when Paul Fishman was sworn in, all predicting great things for New Jersey's new U.S. attorney. Paul Fishman in his first televised sit-down, our only guest for this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
He's now the top federal prosecutor in the state, New Jersey's United States Attorney, responsible for everything from ferreting out corruption to tracking terrorists. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and on this edition of Due Process, Paul Fishman in his first TV sit-down since his star-studded swearing in.
As I arrived, I realized that this is unquestionably the largest assemblage of people ever brought in one place for a swearing in of a U.S. attorney.
Or, as the Star Ledger put it, events don't get much bigger than this in New Jersey.
I have every confidence that Paul will fulfill his responsibilities with his characteristic skill and determination and will be a superb United States attorney for this district.
And the names don't get much bigger either. From the Attorney General of the United States to the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security to an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, thank you. It's truly a pleasure for me to participate in this very happy occasion today, and I'd like to ask Paul to step forward.
But there's a reason they all turned out for Paul Fishman. In his nearly 15 years in either the office of the New Jersey U.S. Attorney
and repeat after me.
Or the Attorney General in D.C. He had worked for each of them. For Sam Alito in the late 80s, when the Justice-to-be was the U.S. Attorney, as first assistant to Mike Chertoff when he had the Newark-based job, for Eric Holder in the Clinton years as a senior advisor to the Justice Department.
Given our long personal history that has been forged in government, in private practice, and in personal matters, I will rely on a man I have come to totally trust and to totally respect. Senators Lautenberg and Menendez, you have truly chosen well.
In fact, one of those senators had tried to choose Paul Fishman a full 10 years before. But George Bush was elected, and his pal Chris Christie got the job.
I think the president is comfortable that I'm someone who shares his goals and his vision.
And those 7 years in the office propelled Chris Christie to an even higher office. He had been faulted for a lack of criminal law and courtroom experience.
You have to decide what the priorities are, and then I have 135 excellent assistant United States attorneys who are going to go out and execute that vision.
That is not the case with his successor.
And I couldn't be more proud about our selection of Paul Fishman, accomplished lawyer, great New Jerseyan. He'll serve our state aggressively and will help to make the streets safer and protect consumers in fighting corruption and enforcing critical federal laws.
And so I know he brings to the job the enormous credibility of someone who has worked literally from the ground up and who's seen all facets, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. And I think that's a commendable set of attributes to have as a United States attorney.
And from Fishman himself, what he intends to do.
Every day, we make judgments and discretionary calls that have a profound and potentially devastating impact on people's lives.
What he pledges
handful of
not to do.
Prosecutors have sometimes pushed the ethical envelope. And when that happens, every case in the country and every prosecutor suffers the consequences. In this district, on my watch, we will not be the ones to fall into that trap.
And what the office means to him.
My name is Paul Fishman, and I represent the United States. Thank you for coming.
Paul Fishman, welcome to Due Process.
Thank you, Raymond.
Let me start by asking you a question that gets asked of me a lot. I travel a lot. And invariably, people either ask a question or make a statement premised on the notion that there's more political corruption in New Jersey than elsewhere. I suppose there are a couple of possibilities. More rigorous enforcement, there is more corruption, or this is a perception with no basis in reality. You have those choices and others, but what's your answer to that assumption, which I'm sure you've encountered given how much time you spent in Washington and elsewhere?
Well, I don't know that there's any truth to that particular assumption. You know, the truth is that our office has had a very successful political corruption program for decades. And it has been a priority of the U.S. Attorney's Office for decades, and we've been very successful at rooting it out. Obviously, we have not been completely successful at eradicating it, and it's one of my priorities. It's one of the Attorney General's priorities. We're going to continue to look at that. But I'm a little reluctant to make comparisons between our state and others. I will say this. I think it's fair to say that most public servants, the vast majority of public servants and public officials in New Jersey and elsewhere, are honest and law-abiding and are in the positions they are in because they believe in public service. And I'm always worried about tarnishing the image of the many with the sins of the few.
But you are aware of that impression in some quarters.
You see it in the media a lot.
And speaking of sins in public life, you made reference to some prosecutors who have pushed the envelope, who have overreached, to someone sitting at home who watched that tape piece and is saying, well, what's he talking about?
Well,
what were you talking about?
There have been a couple of high-profile cases recently. The case of Senator Stevens from Alaska springs to mind, in which prosecutors have been alleged to have gone over the line, not turned over evidence that was exculpatory, not provided the discovery to which defendants are entitled. I think that those cases, somewhat like political corruption, tend to swallow the whole. I think that the people reach a conclusion sometimes from those kinds of events that everyone is bad. And I know that that's not true. I've been in and around law enforcement and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice now for more than 25 years on both sides. I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 11 years. I was in Maine Justice in Washington for 3. I was a defense lawyer for 12.
And having been a defense lawyer for 12 years, for having the longest history of defense work of any U.S. attorney in decades, does it make you more sensitive to these issues?
I hope it makes me more sensitive than I would have been had I not done those things. I think I now know most of my new colleagues from around the country who are U.S. attorneys, and I think uniformly people are very sensitive to this issue regardless of their background and their experience. The Attorney General has made it quite clear that this is very important to him, that this Justice Department conduct itself in the highest ethical manner. The clip you played from my swearing in shows you that that's a view to which I wholeheartedly subscribe. Again, I think my office, for example, handles 1,000 cases a year. Across the country, the Justice Department handles a multitude of that. It's inevitable when you're handling that number of cases that people will make mistakes. I mean, Raymond does civil litigation as well as criminal litigation. He's seen the kind of things that can happen inadvertently in civil litigation. People sometimes fail to turn over material that they should turn over, and they do it simply because sometimes they're overwhelmed or because they've made a mistake.
But it is a special case when the sovereign seeking to take someone's liberty potentially fails to do so.
There's no question about that, and we do everything we can, and there have been a series of memos that have come out of the Department of Justice in the last several months, reiterating what the department's discovery obligations are and directing each of the U.S. attorney's offices to take additional training and other steps to make sure that everyone is aware of his or her obligations, both in the U.S. attorney community and in the investigative community, the FBI, the DEA, and the like. But the point I think that shouldn't be lost is that we have to distinguish between the situations in which an inadvertent mistake is made because someone reviewing a document didn't read it quite the right way or decided that it didn't need to be turned over, from the allegations that sometimes are made about gross intentional misconduct. And I think that kind of allegation, that prosecutors are somehow bad and that they're intentionally trying to do stuff to hide things from the defense, is wrong. The people I know who do what we do for a living are overwhelmingly people of great character who believe in what they do and are trying very hard every day to do the right thing.
Let me get your insight into something that I think interests many citizens in New Jersey and probably elsewhere. At the end of the last administration, there was at least the revelation, though I don't think we had complete hearings, of interference by the White House and perhaps others at Main Justice who shouldn't have been concerned about this with the discretion that U.S. attorneys have to bring cases. It is not a policy argument, but political involvement in the decision-making process. And I'm not suggesting that you had anything to do with that, but you have a lot of insight. And aside from the fact that there's a change in party and a change in personnel, why should citizens believe that that was one unique experience and that there is not a general process of interference politically in an improper sense in prosecutions?
Well, you know, I can only tell you what my own experience has been. You know, and I said it at my swearing in too. The people who spoke at my swearing in were 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, aside from the 2 senators, the prosecutors who I worked for. Sam Alito and Mike Chertoff, who were Republicans, and Eric Holder, who is now the Attorney General, and Jamie Gorelick, who was the Deputy Attorney General. And during the entire time that I worked for them, for Justice Alito and Secretary Chertoff when they were the U.S. attorneys, and for Ms. Gorelick and the Attorney General Holder when they were the Deputy Attorney General, the number 2 person in the department, never once did anyone ever suggest to me or anyone around me that any kind of consideration like that should take part in any decision that we're making.
As far as you know, has the Department of Justice looked internally and said, what went wrong? Let's make sure this doesn't happen again.
I think that has gone on. I mean, I think that the Inspector General and the Office of Professional Responsibility have taken a look at that. You know, I'm not privy to the results of all of their investigations, as I should not be. What I can tell you is that I've known Eric Holder for a long time. He started his career in the department as a young prosecutor, prosecuting public corruption cases around the country. He is committed to making sure that that kind of allegation is not brought against this Justice Department, and I'm confident that it won't happen as long as I'm U.S. Attorney in this district.
Well, before we leave the interesting cast of characters who were at your swearing-in, we had 2 of the most prominent conservatives in the country speaking for you and coming out for you, and then we had several prominent liberals, and I think it might lead someone to say, who is this guy? And what does this mean? Does it say something good about you, or does it say that you're sort of floating in the middle somewhere? What should we read into it?
What I would like you to read into it, and what I think you should read into it, is that during the time that I worked for each of those people, 2 things. One is, as I was hoping I was capturing a little bit with the answer to Raymond's question, is in my professional relationships with each of those people, politics, ideology never played a part in the decisions that we were trying to make. That's first. And I'd like to think that what it means, and it's the sense I got from the unbelievably nice things they said about me in my swearing in, that they think that the advice I gave them and the decisions I made and the work that I did was straight down the middle, nonpartisan, good law enforcement. And that's what the Office of the U.S. Attorney should be about. And I think that, you know, I guess that they have the confidence, and I hope it's justified, that I can continue to do that in this new job.
Let me ask you a question that's sort of non-traditional about a subject that's long concerned many people in New Jersey, and that is gangs. The last Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, Ms. Milgram, said, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And I heard many law enforcement people over the last several years begin to say, you know, we need to have many tools. Insofar as the United States Attorney's Office is concerned and the way you want to conduct it, are you going to have any effective interface with the non-law enforcement, or at least the non-criminal justice aspects of an attack on this problem? That is, do you see yourself as responsible to help make an overall solution and to look at other things in terms of working with other officials and dealing with other aspects of that gang problem in particular?
I would like to do that. Let me back up, though, for a second. We do have a gang problem in New Jersey, and we have a serious gang problem in New Jersey. You know, the newest study will be out sometime, I think, in June or July. The state police do a study every 3 years, and we'll see what the data is. But the trend from 2004 to 2007 was that gangs were on the increase in New Jersey. I still think that that's the case. The state police reported in 2007 that 43% of the municipalities in New Jersey had some form of organized gang activity. And it's not just limited to urban areas. It's now reaching into suburban and rural areas of New Jersey, and I think we have an obligation to do something about that.
But on the law enforcement side, or going to root causes somehow?
Both. I think we have an opportunity to do it on the law enforcement side to a large extent, because we actually have we enjoy tremendous cooperative relationships with state and local law enforcement in this state, and that's a big leg up over other jurisdictions. But to get to your question, you know, we don't have resources in the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring those kinds of other things to the table. What I think we do have is a little bit of the bully pulpit, and I think that I've got I hope, some capital that I can spend in trying to get folks to the table who can do other things. When I was the first assistant U.S. attorney back from 91 to 94, the Justice Department pioneered a program that was called Weed and Seed. There were 3 pilot programs in the country that were designated. One was in Trenton. And what we did was basically designate 3 areas in Trenton, 3 neighborhoods in which we would focus serious law enforcement effort at the federal, in a task force of federal, state, and local folks. And in those neighborhoods, there would also be a host of services that would come together, both from the city and from the state and from other federal agencies, that would try to come in behind or simultaneously with law enforcement and try to, once the neighborhood was a little safer, to try to bolster what was already there in terms of community organizations. And so the name of the program, some people found a little hokey, was going to weed out the bad guys and seed new things. But the idea was that instead of having Gang 1 eliminated and Gang 2 simply show up, that there would be something else for teenagers and other kids in the neighborhood to have as a place to go than gang activity. And so schools were open late, and community services were provided in the schools, job training and educational opportunities, and getting people to sign up to vote.
And where do you wind up in this economy with all of the cutbacks and nobody being able to come up with the funds for these kinds of programs? Is it realistic to think you could do that now?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't know you need new money to do it. I mean,
You're going to keep the schools open, and you're going to have community programs, and you're going to have counseling. You need money.
There's no question about it. But even with cutbacks, there will still be existing social services that are going to be provided both by governmental agencies and by non-governmental agencies, by church groups and by other nonprofits. And the question is whether law enforcement and other government officials, and I'm going to be working with Paula Dow, the new State Attorney General, on these kinds of programs, whether we can bring people to the table to take whatever existing resources they have, even if they've been cut back, and somehow say, instead of you working over there and you doing a jobs program over there, let's try to do something in the same place at the same time so that we can leverage whatever existing resources we have and try to get a bigger bang for our collective buck.
So when you come back in a year or so to talk to us again, it's going to be fair for us to measure in part your success by whether or not you've been able to help the process of galvanizing other resources, so in the long run it isn't trying to arrest our way out of the gang problem.
I'm going to try to do it, and if I didn't think I could do it, I wouldn't try to do it. I can't tell you how successful we're going to be, but I'm optimistic.
Paul, in your office, organized crime has always been an important focus. When we talk now about organized crime in New Jersey, are we still talking about the mafia, or are we talking about these gangs?
Well, we're talking about, I think, a lot of different things. I think there are still vestiges of the old mafia, and there are cases that we have current investigations we have involving folks who belong to those groups. Gang activity is organized crime as far as we're concerned, and the department generally is considering whether to merge gang activity into the strike force, the organized crime strike force concept. But I think the department has quite correctly recognized that organized crime has morphed into something else as well. International organized crime is a huge priority of the departments. There are folks who we see as organized crime from Eastern Europe, from Africa, from other countries and other continents, who are coming here and trying to and organizing themselves either along ethnic lines or around other kinds of activity. And the department now has a new program. There's someone in the Deputy Attorney General's office, which is the number 2 person in the department, someone who works for the Deputy Attorney General, whose charter it is to monitor and organize these international organized crime efforts. And so I think it's even bigger than the way you posited it.
You know, a person trying to understand what the U.S. Attorney's Office does, aside from the fact that many folks don't have a clue unless they've interacted with the office, but those who do might have a hard time thinking about, in terms of terrorism, where does your job function begin as opposed to this huge superstructure, Homeland Security and things happening at Main Justice?
Right.
What does the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey have to do with the process of dealing with terrorism?
Well, our core function in the U.S. Attorney's Office is to investigate and prosecute people who commit crimes, and of course to represent the United States in civil litigation, both defensively and affirmatively. But so on the terrorism front, we get involved when the investigative agencies, the FBI in particular, but also the agencies from Homeland Security, come to us with evidence that they think has something to do with someone about to or having already committed a crime under American law. And we have what we now call a terrorism unit of about 10 prosecutors whose function it is to focus on those kinds of investigations. There's no question.
But do you have the same discretion there as you do in, for example, a gang case or a drug case? You're pretty much going to decide what the prosecutions are, subject to Washington knowing. But in reality, in a terrorist context, are you as free to make judgments, or are you essentially coordinating on a very micro level with Washington?
I think we're certainly coordinating with Washington on a more micro level in terrorism investigations than in other kinds of investigations for all the obvious reasons. And I think that that's a good and it's a healthy thing. Fortunately, in the 4 months I've been here so far on the job, we haven't had anything that's so serious that we've had to deal with those kinds of issues. But we are there, as you probably know, the FBI has a huge number of folks in New Jersey who are dedicated to investigating counterterrorism and counterintelligence kinds of functions. There are lots of things going on in the district all the time, obviously none of which I could talk about on TV, but in both of those areas, both counterterrorism and counterintelligence, and we're involved in some number of those.
One of the things that you were talking about this past week was the case of the scalpers and the tickets for Bruce Springsteen, and that was all very interesting, but it got a banner headline that looked like, you know, Pearl Harbor was struck yesterday in the Star-Ledger. I can't believe that's the most important thing going on in your office. Where do you put it in the list of priorities?
Well, let me answer that question two ways. You know, I'm always loath to second guess the press's treatment of our own stories. You, as a former Star-Ledger reporter yourself, might be in a better position to do that. But it may have just simply been the biggest story of the day, as opposed to the biggest thing in our office.
Was it a huge story from your perspective? Was it a hugely important case?
It's an important case for two reasons. One is it's an important case because I think it's a way in which our office has been able to pick a particular area in which consumers have actually been hurt. Most kinds of consumer-oriented cases are not things that necessarily fall within our bailiwick, but this was a circumstance in which the public was being harmed economically in a particular market, and the people who were allegedly perpetrating that scheme were doing it in a way that violated the federal criminal laws, and so we had an opportunity to do something about that. But I think what really matters more to me about that case in some ways, programmatically, and in the sense of what our office's priorities are, is this. You know, one of the things that's changed dramatically from the 12 years I was out of government till the time I came back in is the emphasis and focus on computers and computer hacking. You know, there was a time when people didn't use computers for very much when they were committing crimes. Now we have a unit of folks in my office who are dedicated exclusively to looking at those kinds of things, both because people actually will use computers and sophisticated computer technology in the most sophisticated cases, but also because the idea of attacking computer infrastructure is itself a national security issue. And so what I think people should understand from that case is that we and our investigative partners at the FBI and other agencies are very focused on that kind of crime because of the threat that it poses to the security of the country.
Here we're going to ask you for a one-sentence answer. Is there a single highest priority in terms of types of crimes you expect to be prosecuted by your office? And keep in mind, we'll ask you about this when you come back.
There's no question that the number one priority for this Department of Justice is national security.
And your role, for example, issues like, did the Christmas bomber, should he have gotten Miranda or be tried elsewhere? Is that the kind of issue you'd be involved in?
Well, you know, I think every U.S. Attorney's office is now poised to have to deal with that issue.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it because, Paul, you will have to come back and talk with us again. We are out of time, but very grateful that you were here.
I thank you for having me.
And Paul, before we sign off, some good news for us. A chance to add to our 14 due process Emmys. Last week, we received 3 more New York nominations for our shows on New Jersey corruption and on voting rights, and for Sandy's overall reporting on law and justice. You can watch what we do anytime online at njn.net/due process. For Sandy and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
U.S. Attorney does. I would think he provides service for the citizens of the United States.
I think he's the one person responsible for making sure that the state of New Jersey adheres to the laws of the state.
He does nothing for New Jersey. That's why we're poverty struck.
I know Christie was the U.S. Attorney. He would take on cases that are of, in this case, I guess, state interests at the statewide level.
He brings about federal prosecutions.
Prosecutes crimes, federal crimes, I imagine. In Jersey, it's probably a little more busy than other places, but yeah, that's what he does.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.